Hello. Today on episode 12 of Society Blends, the main subject is going to be how interactive web maps, route planning and navigation changed everyday trips and holidays. I will not focus specifically on how individuals change the way in which they organize a specific holiday, but mostly how the availability of such features changed the interest in what they could see when they visit a certain place or they carry on with their everyday activities. So first of all, I had to think back to have a retrospective on how much route planning and navigation changed. In the past, we used obvious devices like maps, compasses, and we had to use these primary sources of information and combine them with clues we find along the way, other guides we may have at our disposal, and of course discussions with other persons. However, all these things, all these ways of thinking about a holiday and thinking about trips changed very much as we got used to mobile phones, GPS, and so many other devices and features that changed how we interact with our world. And I thought it interesting to look back upon how much those changes influenced us. All right, so let's move on to the first aspect I wanted to discuss. Classic navigation, route planning. Before the advent of mobile phones and GPS and their massive availability, because this was also another issue that we have to contend with, you had to know and understand very well maps. If you didn't understand enough maps, you would have trouble in identifying certain major goals or places you wanted to cover in your trip. And of course, the issue was much deeper than that, because as you can probably guess, maps being printed creations, being printed products, had a specific life. Of course, they were prone to being damaged. They were prone to being forgotten in certain places, which meant that there was another potential issue that we had with maps back then. The fact that they were quite easily misplaced or damaged. And this meant that all of a sudden you could be without your map. Another important detail is the fact that maps were created with specific goals in mind. If you were navigating a city, probably you were not interested in particular features regarding, I don't know, public government buildings in certain situations, or you were not particularly interested in highways because you were traveling by mass transit. Or if you were just in your native country and in your hometown, for instance, probably you weren't that interested to find out various tourist attractions. You were just focused more on how it was more effective to navigate the streets that you know to a certain extent, and you wanted to find out these clues. Well, everything that was carried out had some sort of success ratio, because just about any kind of map was not perfect in most respects. Maps that strived for a cleaner look, of course, had to keep away some details that could be very difficult to ignore in the map. Others did not have the necessary information. There were maps that you could use in order to travel a country. There were maps that you had to have in order to travel certain cities. And you would have to have so many maps in your possession, both if you were, let's say, planning the trip at home, and you would need them along the way when you were in the place you wanted to visit or to carry out work. And this meant that it was such a hassle in trying to sort all those details, and of course finding sometimes that you need an additional map that you can find only in a specific city or in a specific place, and you would have to purchase that map and add it to your inventory in order to make a better use of the information you have available. So maps had many disadvantages. Of course, they had also some advantages. You have to think about the fact that a map helped you, if of course you had some experience or some inclination and potential in that area, to be much more rational in how you choose certain destinations, how you choose certain routes. You have to think very well in advance and understand the layout of a city. You would even have to understand, not necessarily the layout of the city. You could be making a trip in the mountains, but you would have to understand the layout and the orientation. You have to know the major geographical points. You have to know where the north is, and of course understand how you could navigate a specific path, and then use various clues in order to know where you are. So it required a much more serious understanding of your surroundings and of clues that you were following a certain route or not. And this meant that not as many people as today, not as many persons as today, could be able to follow a route and have a lot of success with it, which meant that we had less inclination to travel routes that probably were less obvious or were not carried out by specific tour operators. However, as technology became available, cheap and plentiful, which meant that just about anyone could use it to the full extent, we found out that sometimes touring a specific area became much easier when you would choose your own goals and you would have a very good negotiation with other persons that were traveling along with you regarding certain places and things you wanted to achieve. And this meant that, of course, some habits changed. The availability of maps even before changed this aspect, because you have to think that maps or detailed maps for transit routes, for a cross-country traveling experience, and even for cities, are not an occurrence that was quite common 100 years prior. Before the Second World War, maps still were not quite commonly available, and they were quite expensive. So the revolution in traveling freedom did not came up until, I think, late 60s up to, let's say, the 90s. I think that was the point at which planning to travel somewhere using maps was probably at the peak. And what came later meant that just more and more people got accustomed to maps. However, the peak was already reached, meaning how many persons could have access, were interested, and travel to various areas. And I think that the advent of more modern navigation only amplified this effect. However, up until the point at which we had the modern navigation technology, maps were essential. And I will show you the difficulty of planning. First of all, I chose quite a complexity to understand how difficult it is for you to have a good grasp of what you wanted to see. Because as mentioned, there were general purpose maps that showed just about any potential interesting area. I don't know, tourist attractions, hospitals, um, accommodations, restaurants, and so many others, while others were for a specific purpose. I don't know, transit maps, tourist maps that covered only the area around the city center, and this meant that traveling was quite simplified in many ways. However, all these things, all these situations changed massively. I will show you another map and discuss more about it. If you look closely, you will notice that this is a transit map. Frequently, when you wanted to visit a specific city, and especially if you wanted to have a better grasp of how living there would mean to you, and of course having as much flexibility as possible, especially taking into account that parking is not necessarily easy, or driving a car is not necessarily easy on a place that you don't know all too well. Using mass transit is a clear favorite way of getting around the city and seeing as many attractions as possible. And over here you see probably some subway stations being marked, and subway stations and routes being marked on a map. And you already understand the difficulty in trying to navigate such a maze, because you have streets, you have certain names that you may not know of, or that are not necessarily obvious to you, and some of them do not relate to points that you necessarily are aware along your route. Yet, however, besides the map that I already shown to you previously, of course, those are different cities, but you don't have to take this into account. You just have to think that you had the general proposed map that you see probably before, how you arrive to a certain city and how large it is, what neighborhoods are there, and probably how you could generally consider the task of trying to have a better understanding of what you're seeing. And then you would have these transit maps that helped you guide as you traveled around a specific with a specific means of transport. And all of these details created an additional layer of difficulty in how you were planning your trip. Of course, they were necessary, but it just went on to prove how difficult the task of getting around a city and using different information sources was. Of course, if you were traveling to a tourist destination, you would still have to face those details, but perhaps, I don't know, the route you would be taking using a ferry may not necessarily be charted as clearly, and then you would have to think about how you would take into account intermediary stops up until your destination, so that you would be aware of your surroundings and when you should prepare for your arrival in a certain place. And of course, if you were traveling on holiday, on a trip in the mountains, you would have to know and understand specific routes on the mountain area that are quite difficult to grasp at first, and you have to constantly monitor because you don't have any way of assessing information. Of course, all of these were normal complexities of everyday life that we had to take into account as we moved along and were more or less successful in our tasks. But it's important because this layer of difficulty was typically encountered. And moving further, you would have even more complex maps that would show you the precise layout of streets, and of transit routes, and probably these were the most important ones when you had to spend some time in a specific place. And the one on the left is quite obvious because it has railway lines, it has many transit stops marked with red for trams probably in a specific area, has many street names, and all of these details compounded create a very difficult but very relevant source of information for how you can handle various tasks easier. And probably if you were really attempting to have a stay in a specific city and try to understand how you could better use the city layout in order to get from one point to another. I don't know, you were on you're on a business trip and you had to reach certain conference areas that were around the city. You would have to travel by mass transit, or you would be taking a taxi or any other ways of other means of transportation. You would have to understand probably what you had nearby, especially if you were a person that was curious and attempted to find out various other things to enjoy. So it was quite a requirement in certain situations to understand a map layout that was as difficult as the one on the left. Although the one on the right is also difficult, I think the one on the left of a highly dense city area is even more difficult for a newcomer to understand. And you have to think that every time most of these maps were being labeled and had additional information that was specific to the country in which it was being printed, which meant that probably you would have to understand at least partly the foreign language of that country in order to make a better understanding of the map you are seeing. So this ultimately meant that there were so many layers of difficulty that it's almost incredible in the sense of how we were able to navigate more or less successfully using them as we get on with our lives. And you have to think even more in our case, in the case of an European, how difficult it would be to travel, for instance, to Asia, to visit South Korea or Japan, and take into account the fact that you would also have to understand specific ways of naming various places that you should visit, and then you would have to navigate and understand all of these details. Of course, this was before such countries placed bilingual labels on some of the areas that were most traveled by tourists. This was before announcements on the public transit would be made in the native language and in a foreign language such as English. So you would have so many difficulties in navigating this vast amount of information and getting to see and enjoy what a foreign experience would mean. Of course, Asian countries, and not only them, have made an effort in order to be more tourist friendly and have also naming that could be presented in English and have guides that were printed in English and other foreign languages. And all of these meant that it was much easier as time went on for foreigners to enjoy their stay in those cities, in those places. However, all of these efforts were made in time. And the experience of a tourist in the 1960s was very different from a tourist experience in 1990s or to early 2000s, when most of these ways of presenting information were much more accessible. And of course, living in a society that, in a global society that faced the challenge of having as many foreigners in a specific place, which was wholly different to, let's say, relatively isolated countries as we had, I don't know, before or after the Second World War, those two were major changes. And those major changes meant that the task we had even before the advent of mobile phones was significantly easier than the same task being carried out 50 years before. So this is important because it already shows that a simplification was possible even before the advent of modern technology that was so accessible and changed it so dramatically. However, all of these informations had to be understood, and a specific way of interpreting them had to be an ability of at least one of the persons that was having the decision power in a group, or let's say in the case of an individual, the individual's ability to navigate and use all those details to his or her advantage. And I think that all of these were important, and sometimes we cannot quite grasp how much our experience has changed as time went on. So I wanted to show to you and mention all these details because the reality of being a tourist or even a citizen of a specific area, of a specific city and town was changed dramatically as maps became more common and we understood better where we were living and what were our immediate surroundings. All right, so we get to the first major point of inflection. I have to state something very clearly. Even before Google Maps was available, even before all these automated or partially automated ways of traveling and of monitoring progress in a specific area were available, the GPS system was established. In the 80s, it was made available for specific research and military purposes. At the beginning of the 90s, this technology was getting cheaper and cheaper, and of course it was being used for various commercial purposes, whether we are thinking about private airplanes or marine applications like traveling from one place to another on a yacht. Yes, all of these applications were possible. Of course, devices were quite bulky, and their implementation required specially trained persons and required maintenance. But of course, the availability of such a technology was very important. Of course, right now there isn't just a single standard of GPS. There is also, besides the American system, there is a Russian system and probably a Chinese global positioning system, because it's just an array of satellites that convey the information and that can be used to track it with specially designed devices. But what I wanted to mention, the fact that even before Google Maps appeared, even some handheld devices for GPS were made available. And this is quite important because as miniaturization moved on, in the early 2000s, it was already possible for you to have a portable GPS receiver. And that portable GPS receiver would obviously have the map of the area in which you would probably travel to. Of course, all these maps had to be manually transferred into your device. So it was still quite difficult to take your device and travel, I don't know, in Europe, all around Europe, or even getting to another continent easily, because it would mean that probably you would have to delete and transfer to your device another map and have it available by the time of your trip. And as everything was done offline, of course, there was the potential of many issues that could arise. But as I said, beginning in the 2000, even before 2004 or 2005, 2005 being the year in which Google Maps was launched, it was important to note that handheld GPS devices were available, and they already made quite an impact, because GPS devices, or GPS connected devices, because ultimately it's not just a GPS receiver, it's a GPS receiver, and you have to have a specific display and a way of interpreting information so that you are shown to be somewhere on a particular map. So it's much more difficult than that. But simplifying it, it's important to note that some persons already got accustomed to it, to this technology, while others were not but heard about it. So the availability of Google Maps and the integration of GPS receivers on mobile phones, that probably started around 2004, meant that the landscape was changed dramatically. And it's very important to understand how much of a revolution came later, because up until that point, GPS receivers and devices that could show you a map and update your position, were devices that cost around hundreds of dollars. Yes, this was before 2000s, and it still meant that after 2000s, there were some devices that still cost that much. Of course, the cost was reduced. You have to understand that in the beginning of the 90s, the cost was probably in the thousands of dollars. But the next major step was the fact that probably in a device that would cost only some hundreds of dollars, you would have a GPS receiver and the ability to update a map and show where you were located. And this was possible as early as 2008, when Google released Google Maps for iOS and Android devices. And this was the point at which truly our lives have been on a path towards a massive change that we may not entirely grasp today, although we thoroughly enjoy and appreciate, being a perk of living in this modern world. The fact that such a combination of software and hardware was available in 2008 changed dramatically the landscape, because it meant that on a device that you could probably carry in your pocket, and one that you were already using, although not as successful as today, for making photos and being one of the essential devices to carry on your communication and other purposes, you already have a necessary and an essential way of simplifying your navigation, your travel routes, everything that pertains to your everyday or your holiday trip planning. And this was a massive change that I think had some lasting impact. I chose the picture you see on this presentation as I thought about the availability of such GPS and interactive navigation systems on cars, because this is also another area where the easy availability of information really made a massive change in the comfort of our, let's say, traveling entertainment, ultimately, that we could have on a specific area. And all this capability was enhanced and made possible entirely due to the cost reductions that were made possible by advanced technology. And I think that this is very important for what came next. Of course, I mentioned GPS on phones. Mobile phones initially did not have a GPS. But the moment when GPS receivers were made available and were combined with the capability of phones, and such a mapping application was made available, it was a game changer. Because up until that point, you would still have to carry your maps, you would still have to carry potentially a mobile GPS receiver that should have had its maps updated, and you would still have to use a dual system. Right now, starting in around 2009, 2010, it was obvious that a phone could totally replace all the devices you were previously using for navigation and trip planning. And this was a massive change. Of course, GPS receivers on phones initially were not having a very high performance. Standalone GPS receivers had better reception and were generally much more reliable in what we are doing. However, mobile phones were always available and they were constantly updated. And it meant that some few generations along the way, probably in 5 more years by 2015, GPS receivers and the combination of the capabilities that was made available on phones meant that a standalone GPS receiver was not required anymore, and maps could be less and less relevant. And this is the point at which it was more and more obvious that phones and GPS receivers and all this technology that is being integrated truly has changed our lives. And I think that this is an essential moment because for hundreds of years we have been carrying out everything that was pertaining to the planning of our movements around a certain area using at most a map, if not using a compass and various clues we had along our way in order to do so. Right now it was possible to navigate even a very complex maze like an urban landscape and enjoying it as much as possible. This was also much more important because in the last decades more and more effort was being placed in improving the life in cities, and of course so many heritage areas were made available and were improved in various cities. And this meant that traveling for holiday purposes, not only on holiday resorts but also in cities, became an attraction that was quite important. Even for persons that were probably living most of their lives in a specific city, the ability of having an easy to use map improved their possibilities, increased their potential of seeing other interesting areas and being able to enjoy more their lives. And I think that this is a detail that is very important, and that was possible, of course, due to the advanced technology we have today. All right, moving further. It would have been much less attractive if we could only plan a specific destination and we would use that as a guidelines. But when we could plan our route to reach certain places and there was always already a way in which a specific optimum path would be presented to you, meant that much more possibilities could be evaluated for various purposes. I mean that you could specify an intermediary destination, you wanted to reach a specific place, and then you want to get to another area of interest. And you could create your route to cover those two interesting points, and then your handheld computer, that of course is your mobile phone, would probably offer you a proposal for how to reach those areas and show it to you on the map, and of course could update you as you were traveling so that you could keep the route you already set, and of course could mention how fast you could reach a specific place, and could make everything about planning and interesting changes along the way entirely possible and very easy to handle. And I think that this on-the-spot guidance is one of the true benefits of having all of these devices connected on the internet, because they could be updated. This is also an important aspect I have not mentioned previously, but maps can become outdated. And it may not be entirely obvious when this may happen. It may happen in 1 month, or it may happen in a couple of years, depending on how much a specific place changes. And this was especially important in the case of cities, because there could be massive infrastructure or urban development that could result in disturbances of certain travel routes. And this is even more obvious when we have to think about areas that we have even less information about. And all this possibility of on-the-spot guidance has only increased as time went on, and of course more features were added. But if we did not have all this, probably it would have still been a wonderful occurrence to use such a modern means of planning. And we are getting towards the next stage. Why I thought about showing you this picture? It doesn't have any sort of grasp with the situation, except for one important detail. If you think a bit, you can obviously understand the complexity of living in a certain area in a city that of course could be having major renewals and changes that I alluded to previously. But the augmented reality capability was only recently being made available to Google Maps and other applications. However, it is very interesting because it provides an additional layer of information that could be superimposed on your current surroundings, which means that you have an even easier way of navigating a specific area and understanding what you are seeing in front of you, various details that probably before would have been unknown to you. And the advent of augmented reality is only going to be even more pervasive, as probably even complex mazes of access routes to, I don't know, a specific railway station or a specific subway station, or even inside the public buildings, could be made much easier if you would have the layout, and that layout would be known to your navigating application in advance. So the chance of you getting into an area that probably is closed or that is experiencing other differences, other, let's say, issues in terms of availability would be reduced. And this would be a major advantage, especially for persons that were not particularly living in a certain area, were just on travel and they wanted either to discover or they had to get to another area and they thought they could navigate on their own. And all of these additional details that are being made available make a major impact on anyone's life. And I wanted to present the idea of augmented reality as an additional layer that simplifies our lives and offers so much information that we could enjoy our trips in urban areas, as well as ones that were probably even less, were probably even wilder, because I assume that in the case of some popular destinations, some popular touristic destinations, you would have probably the layout and various details already provided to your application. And all of this means that as we evolve and as technology allows us, probably we will be able to do even more in our trips and enjoy them even more with so many data that could really make us have a very good experience along the way. And I see that as a massive opportunity that is only going to be magnified in the future and is going to be even more obvious as time goes on. Well, of course, nothing is rosy. I chose this picture again mostly as a break from what I was saying, but still I think it conveys some interesting details. It has its own symbolism, because even if we get on to travel on a specific area, sometimes we may still need to find a particular map, or we may still need to be able to work also with another way of information representation. And I think that is very important, because the more we are dependent on such devices, the more we have to accept the fact that sometimes those devices may fail, and we should still be able to make a connection between our current situation and a specific plan we have for an area. So being able to navigate a traditional map and understanding where you are is still an ability that matters a lot, especially when technology is not made available. Due to various disturbances, for instance, I don't know, weather could make such an important disturbance, but also natural disasters or man-made disasters in the case of wars. So we should still be able to use traditional navigating and planning tools like a compass and a map, even if we are so much more reliant on mobile phones and devices that help make our task a lot easier. But I wanted just to show to you that it's not a given that we are able to use our devices. And this was particularly clear before, when more people had to, well, experienced the first navigating technologies that use the GPS receivers on phones, and sometimes because maps were not updated as they should, they ended up in a different place just because the route planning was not very good, or because there was no signal, they got lost and they could not find their route easier to get out of a specific place. And all of these issues, of course, that still happen, but happen on a smaller scale, goes on to show that we should not be forgetting all of these details and way in which we used information before the advent of modern technology. And I still think that they do have their charms, not only for retro purposes or for as a curiosity, but also as an ability to be, from my point of view, a citizen that is quite capable of making good decisions regardless of context. And this will probably shown to be a good ability, a good personal ability in your life. Of course, since we are getting closer to the ending, we have also to think about the future potential. And I think that the future potential is massive, because the moment you are thinking about having a device that is no longer your computer, because of course I have not mentioned the fact that before such technologies were made available on mobile phones, they were available on computers. You could buy digital maps, but then you could probably not use them when you were traveling, except if you had a laptop, and everything could be made to fit on your laptop, but having a GPS device was probably not possible. So before the 2000s, it was quite difficult to do much more than plan your trip in advance and then probably have a map to improve the route planning on specific cases. However, as mentioned, all of these ways in which we were carrying on our tasks have massively changed. And I think that this picture conveys very well the meaning, because we had maps, we had computers, we had printers, we have screens, and all of this information was used for us to make the necessary assessment, the primary assessment of our planning potential. However, as we move on and mobile phones are more and more capable of driving the entire digital revolution, probably using even virtual reality and augmented reality capabilities that could be seamlessly integrated in our lives is going to make us even more capable of enjoying a different area, whether we are truly in that area, or if you want to have a particular taste of what happens. And for instance, in order not to be overly generalist in my assessment, I will describe to you mostly, because I cannot show such a thing, but you have to imagine that it's possible and that it has been done, though I don't know of a plan that has been carried out as extensively. But think about an aspect. Right now we see our cities, our touristic areas in the situation in which they are currently, of course, present. However, if more information can be aggregated on a device, and of course put in the right context and everything made to work seamlessly, you could imagine using your mobile phone or using something like transparent glasses that you could carry, that the entire area you would have in front of your eyes could be, of course, simulated with a specific look that the city or the area had in the past. And this sort of reenactment, I think, holds a massive potential in how much we can enjoy our lives and our trips and our experiences. It's just a small fact, but think about the potential. There is a lot of history that is not present in our areas anymore. There were changes in, of course, even some mountains were looking some decades ago due to the evolution of various let's say architectural plans, and also due to the fact that various buildings have been damaged by natural or man-made disasters, which means that we are mostly shielded, or we were shielded from all of these before, and we would have the, let's say, relatively bland experience of a museum. With such advanced devices that could pinpoint with high accuracy where we are actually placed, it could be possible for us to live the experience, or to have as close as possible the experience of living in a different time, in a different place than we are seeing today. And I think that this goes on to show that probably there are massive changes that could be made just using the technology we have accumulated up until now, and of course building upon it with the necessary performance and capabilities that we are able to incorporate. And of course it's just one of the many instances where the potential for complex trip assessments is being improved. And of course you can think about the other aspects, like even getting to meet someone could be made altogether in an experience that would probably resemble, I don't know, a Pokemon game or any sort of other game that could use augmented reality, which would show you clues along the way and probably would make the experience much more interesting than what your eyes see, or particularly the connection between what your device shows and what the real world has as its clues for how you navigate and reach a specific person, reach a specific place. And I think that this goes on to show that there is massive potential. And I am entirely sure of that, and we will probably see all sorts of experimentations that will make our life much more fulfilled than we had up until this point. So I think that the future holds a lot of promise. And I still think that the road that has been opened with mobile devices and this interesting availability of a technology that could pinpoint, could position us accurately and determine our position with pinpoint accuracy all around the world, or in most of the places that we could travel. I think it's a massive perk we have as citizens of such an advanced society. And I think that we should be much more interested in, and we should be enjoying what will come ahead. And of course, I think we are almost at the end. You can probably guess why I have chosen such a picture, possibilities, and all of these are massive in how we can enjoy everything along the way. And think about all the history, think about all the details that could be presented to us as we travel a route that seems so mundane to us. And especially if we are relieved of the entire hassle and stress of having to travel our routes by driving or by doing anything that requires our entire attention, you will quite easily grasp how interesting our experience could be made, how enticing, how much emotionally involving it could be. And of course, how much we could understand, how much our knowledge would be improved all along the way. So I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you like, please subscribe to the channel. And I hope you will find much more other interesting videos I have made along the way on this social blends, series or others. And I hope you will have a pleasant day.